This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. The election in 2010 brought 63 new Republican members to the House of Representatives, and we know that result. But did you know that Republicans picked up at least 675 state legislative seats in the same election? Lawrence Norden, the deputy director of the Brennan Center's democracy program, knows those results, and he's my guest today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Before we hear all this news, would you tell us a little bit about the Brennan Center and the democracy program?
Sure. The Brennan Center is located at NYU Law School. We were founded by the clerks of the late and great Justice Brennan.
That's lovely.
Who was a great believer in democracy and expanding the franchise, and also worked on, of course, many important legal issues in helping the poor. So we have a democracy program and a justice program. I'm in the democracy program. The democracy program works to do a number of things, works on campaign finance reform issues, works on redistricting, also works on voting rights in elections and ensuring as much as possible that everybody that is eligible to vote can vote and that their votes will be counted. The
report you wrote with Wendy Weiser, who's the director of the democracy program, is about the changes in the ability to vote.
Yeah.
Right? But also the redistricting is it's the same thing, isn't it? I mean, it's part of the same phenomena that state legislatures are now redistricting, and that's going to be a thing?
I think there's a relationship, particularly this year, in the fact that, I mean, with redistricting, this has always been the case to a certain extent, less so with election administration, but it's become very partisan. We recently saw in Arizona the governor basically firing the independent redistricting chairman because she didn't like the plan that came out that is supposed to be independent.
No, but I understand now what the difference is that we've always had a tradition of trying to get as many people to vote as possible or working to that way, and now with the election of all these new Republican members of the state legislatures, the move is to restrict the ability to vote.
Yeah, and I think election administration, the issue of how we run elections and who can vote, has become politicized in a way that we haven't seen for decades. You know, this started happening a little bit after 2000, of course. But really, even after 2000, the trajectory is the same as it has been for decades in the United States. I would say since at least the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and the idea has been always make voting easier, expand the franchise to as many people as possible. And this year, that all came to a grinding halt, and we've seen really for the first time in a dramatic way an assault on voting rights that we haven't seen in the U.S. in decades, I would say.
Which is very threatening to us as citizens, right?
Yeah, and
it's core to elections.
It's core to elections, and frankly, it's not good for our democracy. Leaving aside the issue that, you know, which is a very important issue, that everybody that's a citizen and is over 18 should be able to vote. They legally should be entitled to vote, and we shouldn't be putting hurdles up for them. I do think there's something very corrosive to our democracy and to the public's understanding of the way government should be working when they see what can easily be perceived as an attempt to change the rules of the game merely for political advantage.
And this, you think, is a political advantage because these rules basically they hurt traditional Democratic voters?
Well, there's no question that the impact of these laws is disproportionately going to be on minority voters, African American voters, and Latinos, on students, and on the elderly. And you know, if you look at some of the comments of legislators who pushed these laws, there's no question that there was like a very partisan aspect to this. in general, although not absolutely. There were Republicans who stood against these laws, and there were Democrats in some cases who pushed them. But it's fairly clear in almost all cases that it was Republicans that were pushing these laws and Democrats who were fighting against them. And again, I don't think that is a good dynamic for the way we run our elections.
Does this run parallel to the Tea Party interests?
To some extent. Again, if you look...
We say 600 and some odd new members of state legislatures. Some of them were obviously members of the Tea Party, right?
Yeah, and what you did see in 2010, again, to a degree that we haven't ever seen before, is people were specifically running on these issues. They promised to enact these kinds of laws when they got into office, and they did, so they kept their word. And I don't think we really have seen the issue of how we run elections as part of an election campaign to the same degree before. People often ask me, what changed? What suddenly changed this year about all these laws passed? A lot of the argument to pass many of these laws is, and we can talk a little bit about it, is this demon of voter fraud, that you have to protect against these people illegally voting and changing the results of elections. That was without question part of the conversation in many local races in 2010.
Was that tied into immigration, do you think?
There's no question that some of this, and particularly in states in the Southwest and the South, immigration is a big issue, and the idea that there are, which there's absolutely no evidence for, but the idea that somehow there are illegal aliens that are risking their lives in deportation and going to jail and tens of thousands of dollars of fine to cast one vote. But there's no question that that's part of the fear that's driving this. And, you know, it's impossible to say, I think, what people's motivations are in passing laws, and I don't doubt that there is among many a belief that there is this danger of illegal voting going on, but there's no evidence for it. There have been many, many studies on this, and they all come to the same conclusion, that there's no evidence of this.
So let's talk about what the restrictions are. Or what do you want to talk about first, the states or the restrictions?
Well, we can talk about the restrictions, because really this is a national phenomenon, and it's not, you know, there are, at this point, over a dozen states that have passed these restrictive laws, but unfortunately there will probably be more to come in the coming months. So, you know, of the kinds of restrictions that we're seeing, the most common one that has passed this year are voter ID laws. Those are requirements that in order to vote and in order to have your vote counted, you have to have a very specific kind of government-issued photo ID. So in most cases, for instance, a student ID is not allowed. Your benefits card, if you're working with some kind of getting benefits from some kind of social service agency, is not allowed. The only kinds of ID that are generally allowed under these laws are driver's licenses, military ID, passport, and then
naturalization papers.
Naturalization papers would not be enough.
Really?
In Texas allows concealed handgun permit, and so does Tennessee, but they won't allow things like student IDs. But you know,
concealed weapons, right? Is that what you said?
A concealed handgun permit.
Right.
Yeah, that would be allowed. And you know, and obviously the IDs that you choose to allow people to use in order for them to vote is some kind of selection in who is ultimately allowed to vote. And the worst of these laws say, doesn't matter what else you do to verify who you are. If you don't have one of those IDs in the first place, your vote is not going to count.
You can't challenge them.
Yeah, there's nothing you can do, basically. Now, that's not all laws. Many of these laws provide some kind of alternative, or I should say some of these laws provide some kind of alternative method. But
which states are the worst?
Of the new laws that have passed, I would say Wisconsin's and Texas have the worst laws, and that's because they're most limited in what's allowed, and in terms of the forms of ID that are allowed, and they don't provide any kind of alternative verification. So even if you're able to provide all your identifying information, you know, your social security card number, your signature matches to what it was with what you registered, even then they won't count your votes.
So the Wisconsin, is that being challenged now?
It is not being challenged yet.
Does that mean it's going to be in effect in 2012?
It likely means that it's going to be in effect in 2012. Texas has to under the Voting Rights Act, certain states have to, before laws can go into effect, they have to get them what's called pre-cleared.
That's because they've been historically bad.
Right. They have a history of discrimination, and there are certain jurisdictions that fall under that. So Texas and South Carolina, which also passed one of these ID laws, they have to get that pre-cleared by the Department of Justice. Florida does not have an ID law. They have some other bad laws. They also have to get that pre-cleared. So we don't know yet if those laws will be in effect in November.
Right. And then let's go on.
Yeah. So
the voter ID is a very difficult thing. I mean, do all the states say if you go to the Motor Vehicle Bureau and you get something from them, that's enough?
Yes. The problem is there are a couple of problems with that. One is the Supreme Court made pretty clear that you have to offer a free ID to people. This can't be a poll tax. If they can't afford it, you have to give it to them for free. Wisconsin has instructed the Department of Motor Vehicles not to tell people that they're entitled to a free ID. Somebody has to ask for it. So there actually have been instances of people showing up and saying that they didn't have the money, but because they didn't specifically request a free ID, they were turned away. But even beyond that, because most states are offering free IDs and many of them are making that clear, they're not offering for free the underlying documentation that you have to get in order to get an ID. So, and again, this really impacts the poorest voters and older voters. They may, if you, for instance, you don't have your birth certificate, there's a fee to pay to get your birth certificate. It can be $15, $25, $30. Yeah. If you are married and your name changed, you may have to get your marriage certificate. If you were divorced, you may have to get your divorce certificate. All those things cost money. And not only that, but in many cases, if you're out of state, you may have to use a credit card. A lot of the poorest people don't have credit cards to buy those things. And then, of course, when you're dealing with older people, particularly people who were born in rural areas, they may not have a birth certificate. And we've seen that in places like Tennessee, where there are two women in their 90s who they just didn't have, they've been voting for years, they didn't have their birth certificates, and they weren't able to get.
So this means this isn't for registration of new voters. This is for old voters who come to the poll to vote.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next.
Sure. So another very troubling, I would say that, first of all, that there are kind of four categories of this.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Voter ID.
Yeah.
Then there's proof of citizenship, which is related to what we were just talking about in this kind of fear of illegal aliens voting. There are registration restrictions, making it much more difficult for people to register. And then cutbacks on early and absentee voting. In particular, early voting in Ohio and Florida really cut back dramatically, and elimination of early voting on Sundays, which is when many African Americans were voting in disproportionate numbers. Of course, for working people being able to vote on Sunday. Yeah. And it was very successful in Ohio. I don't know if a lot of people will remember in 2004 there were these long lines. Yeah. And they really got rid of them. They have now gone back in the direction of having to worry about these lines.
So let's go to the bizarre requirements now or restrictions on registering voters.
Yeah, well, these are very troubling.
It's hard to believe that happens in this country.
Yeah, and I mean, first of all, we have a kind of backward registration system in the United States anyway. I would say there are all kinds of problems with our registration system. Unlike many countries where they use lists from DMVs, from social service agencies, other kind of citizenship lists, and use those to form the voter registration lists. In the U.S., there is this system that is kept by counties where individuals have to send in their registration forms, and their third-party registration groups like the League of Women Voters that register people, and all these forms have to get processed. There are always all kinds of mistakes in these forms. And then people have problems when they come to the polls because their names aren't in the polls. Anyway, it's not a great system to begin with, and now a number of states are making it more difficult for anybody that wants to help people register. So the League of Women Voters has been a big group in registering voters. They've said under the laws in Florida they can't register anybody anymore. They've halted their operations because the laws are so onerous. To give you one example, In Florida now, if somebody is registered, that form has to get into the election offices within 48 hours. So, you know, if the mail is slow, not only are you out, there's a fine associated with sending in a registration form that gets there 3 days later. So a great and horrible example of this is a teacher in Florida who decided that she wanted to register her students. She's done it every year. She sent in their forms. She now is facing $1,000 in fines because they got there more than 2 days after they signed up in class. So, you know, and hundreds of thousands of people were registered in Florida before the 2008 election, excuse me, through these registration drives. And they are, again, they're disproportionately African American and Latino voters. They register twice as often as whites do through third-party registration drives. So,
and the Obama candidacy, really, a lot of the votes of the people who were registered this way voted for him. I mean, that was a big thing in their campaign, wasn't it?
Well, and it's certainly, you know, a lot of this does seem like it is in reaction to the 2008 election. And again, I think whatever the motives are, there's no way of avoiding, I think, the perception that people get that this is simply an attempt in many cases to manipulate the rules of the game to favor, you know, a particular party or candidate.
It's really shocking that this can go on. There are no national, I mean, what's the now, I mean, there are national laws about voting.
Yes.
But all of these state things can circumvent that, or what?
Yeah, I mean, we have a strange electoral system in the United States where we give a lot of the authority to running elections to the states and even down to the county level. Right. We're just such a big country that in some cases that makes sense. We have diverse communities, but there are things like the Voting Rights Act which prevent outright discrimination against particular groups of persons. And as I said, in states with a history of discrimination, there's a section of the Voting Rights Act that says they have to get clearance from the federal government before they can go ahead and make these changes. But there's certainly more that the federal government could be doing to prevent these things from happening in the future. And you know, the Brennan Center has been pushing a lot of legislation that we would like to see Congress take up that would, if not prevent these things from happening, blunt
but the Republicans will not vote for that, right?
I think it's unlikely that we're going to get this legislation passed in this session. But it's certainly something that we should keep our eyes on for the future. And it's unfortunate, you know, I think a lot of us were hoping after 2008 that we would be able to get some of these things passed, and it didn't happen.
In 2000, so you had that 2-year window, but you didn't get it through. So what are the dire consequences that can come from this? I mean, talk about the difference with the Electoral College, for instance, and then also for the national vote. Sure.
Well, we tabulate, and this is just the states that have passed laws so far. I want to emphasize that there's still 44 bills out there in a number of states, key states, that may pass in the next year, including in Pennsylvania and Michigan. But even forgetting what may be to come, in the 14 states that have either passed laws or taken executive action that restrict voting rights, that represents about 2/3 of the electoral votes needed to win an election. And there are many of these are battleground states, perhaps not surprisingly, like Wisconsin, Georgia,
Ohio.
States that were very, Ohio, Florida, states that have been very close traditionally in presidential elections. And we estimate that at least 5 million people these laws could make it significantly more difficult for them to vote. One thing I want to emphasize is, for the most part, none of these new laws make it impossible for people to vote. It's extra barriers. So that's the good news on this, the silver lining. And I think there is something for civic engagement organizations to be doing in the coming months, which is to help people get over these hurdles, because that's really what they are. You know, having to pay money to get these IDs, not being able to vote when you used to be able to vote, maybe not having an organization like the League of Women Voters be able to register you anymore. All these things, there are ways around them. It's just makes it much more difficult.
So is there an overall organization that one can contribute to fund these kinds of campaigns or pay for these fees?
Well, there are different organizations that are working on things like this. The League of Women Voters is working with people to get them IDs. There's an organization called State Voices, which is working with folks. And it really depends on the state, wherever somebody is, if they want to look at, and this is something that's easy to do over the internet, who is working with in a particular state to get people IDs. That information is pretty readily available.
There's a figure somewhere, something like 5 million votes are at risk this way. Is that what you've?
Yeah, that's our estimate. And I think that's really a conservative estimate. Is that this is going to make it significantly harder for 5 million Americans to vote, and that's 5 million Americans who are eligible citizens who should, who should be able to vote.
And the difference in the recent elections has been what?
It's been less than that. Yeah. In 2 of the last 3 presidential elections, it's been less than that, and I think a lot of people are expecting a close election again. So there's no question that this stuff is going to have a real impact on elections. I am hopeful that most of those 5 million people will find a way to vote, but I think the 5 million gives you some sense. Not all of them are going to be able to of the impact that this is likely to have.
What about absentee ballots? The military absentee ballots are separate, is that right? Or are they affected by any of the state legislation?
For the most part, they are not affected. What we've seen in absentee, we've seen a couple of interesting things happen in absentee. Not too much has passed, but there have been a couple of battles over absentee ballots. One was in, and this falls under more administrative action, which I think, unfortunately, we're going to see more of in 2012. A lot of people remember Ken Blackwell in Ohio, things that he did in 2004 to make it more difficult for certain people to vote. We saw the same thing in 2000 in Florida. This year, we've started seeing some of these things already around the country. So an example of that is the Secretary of State in Colorado, and this has to do with absentee voting. They have all mail-in votes in off-year elections. And he attempted to prevent anybody who hadn't voted in the 2010 election from getting ballots to mail in 2011. So essentially, he was trying to freeze the electorate in 2010.
So
and say,
in 2010, if you hadn't gotten an absentee ballot, you couldn't get another one?
In 2010, if you hadn't voted, you would not get an absentee ballot, and that was the only way to vote in 2011, because they don't have polling places in 2011. So we actually fought that, and he lost in court, although he says he's going to be pursuing that. Again, he's going to continue to pursue that. So that we saw. We also saw in Ohio, the Secretary of State attempted to. He ultimately had to go back on this, but there were certain places like Cleveland and Columbus where they would mail prepaid applications for absentee ballots. Because there's a cost, obviously, associated with that, and the poorest people often wouldn't vote or wouldn't get an application for that reason. He tried to prevent them from doing that. Ultimately, he relented. But that's kind of, those are the kinds of battles that we're seeing right now in absentee ballot.
People in some states are looking very hard to find ways to keep people from the polls.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, unfortunately, there's also often a message of scaring people. We've seen that in Maine. Secretary of State has been very active in, I would say, helping to discourage students from voting. He sent letters to students who were paying out-of-state tuition, but were living in Maine and were entitled to vote in Maine, telling them that.
I read that, but when the census is taken, aren't the students living in Maine counted as Maine residents? They are.
And the Supreme Court has been very clear on this, that for students, you can vote if you're a resident of that state, even if you're not paying for if you're living in that state at the time, it's your choice. You can vote.
Right. But that state is the crazy governor that took down all the murals, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So I mean, when do people realize how ridiculous government is? Some governments are.
Well, I do think we may be reaching a little bit of a tipping point on this stuff. In the past few months, we've, it has not gotten, I work in this area, so I think it should always be getting more attention. I don't think this kind of what's happened in the past 9 months has gotten as much attention as it should have, but I do think over the past couple of months, there has been growing recognition of how serious this is. And we have started to see some pushback. So one example is in Maine, where the legislature and the governor tried to get rid of Election Day registration, which has been so effective in bringing out people to vote and getting extra people voting. They now have today, on Election Day, they have a referendum to overturn that. And we sort of seeing the same thing in Ohio. There's a referendum to overturn what was a pretty restrictive law.
But that's not going to be voted on today.
That's going to be voted on next year.
Next year. But they won't be able to use it if it fails or something.
They won't be able to use it in November 2012, and then the question is, will the
there are a couple we're coming near the end of this program. We never talked about felons and eliminating them to be eligible to vote.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Governor Christ in Florida and Governor Vilsack in Iowa help make it easier for people who are now out of prison to get their voting rights back. There have been an absolute ban on that, and this is frankly a remnant of Jim Crow laws. And unfortunately, in both Iowa and Florida, the current governors overturned that, and making it virtually impossible for people who have been convicted of felonies to ever vote again.
Who have completed their sentence.
Who've completed their sentence are tax-paying citizens.
So isn't that arbitrarily adding another sentence to them? Or?
It is. It is. And
so will that be challenged in courts?
Well, that issue has gone up to the courts a number of times, and I think, unfortunately, for now anyway, that's going to remain the law.
Now, I got a notice that there is a march or some kind of demonstration in New York in December.
Yeah.
Is that's going to happen, and that's the kind of thing you're doing? Is happening.
That's a great thing that is happening. I think that's being run by SEIU and the New York NAACP. And it's another step that needs to be taken just to make people aware. The more people are educated about this, the more power they have to make sure that it's not impacting voters and preventing them from voting.
So everybody can go to your website?
Yeah, Brennan Center, BrennanCenter.org.
Yeah, and then go on to the democracy program?
Yes.
And you can read the whole report? You
can read the whole report. And I would encourage people, there's a whole voting rights section that is constantly updated in terms of what's changing in the laws and what's happening.
And it's very interesting, so people should definitely read it. It's also very readable. But then at the same time, you're working on campaign finance, which is another disastrous area?
Yes.
And the redistricting? Are you doing that much? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this year may be an opportunity, speaking of campaign finance reform, to get some real reforms and hopefully public financing modeled on the New York City system in New York State. I think that's an issue where you talk about things like Occupy Wall Street. I think people really have a sense that the rules of the game are rigged, and that special interests really just have too much sway over government. So, and redistricting. Redistricting.
That's also been brought to the public attention in Arizona, where they didn't the governor didn't like the plan, and so it's out, right?
So it's out, and there are going to be lots of fights.
Well, I think as citizens, we have to be very indebted to the Brennan Institute.
Oh, thank you.
And to you and to your work, and so I hope everybody will go to that website and learn and keep up to date.
Thanks, and thanks for having me on to talk about this.
Thank you very much. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.